So if it's okay with you, I'm going to work without a mic. Can you hear me in the back? Gotcha. So we are going to talk about talent management today. And first thing we're going to do is define it. What is talent management? What does it mean? What are the functions of talent management? And we're actually going to spend a little time talking about the word talent and what that actually means. Then we're going to talk about where the HR profession fits with this whole world of talent management. And then we're going to look at where managers fit in the whole world of talent management. And then we're going to end by talking about the single biggest mistake in the world of talent management. And my prediction is many of you work for organizations that make this mistake. So people are already nodding, right? I haven't even said what the mistake is, but whatever it is, you're making it. So, and of course, it wouldn't be fair to just talk about the mistake without talking about how to avoid the mistake. So, as you heard in the introduction, I really like talking about talent management, but I want to spend a little time before that talking about my favorite topic, which is myself. So, a little bit about me. As you heard, I teach at Pepperdine. I very recently came out with this book called Aha Moments in Talent Management, and I'll talk to you about how that came about. But before that, I wrote a couple of books on corporate universities, and before I actually became a professor, I actually worked for a living, and my background is primarily in learning and development. And what happened was, when I decided to pursue a PhD, I wanted to get a PhD in business, and I was working at USC at the time, so I walked over to the business school and said, hey, I'd like one of those PhDs you guys give out. And they said, sure, just quit your job, become a full-time student and graduate assistant for 4 or 5 years, and we'll give you a PhD. Well, I was already a grown-up with a mortgage and all of that. I couldn't be a full-time student at the time. So I walked over to the School of Education, where you could earn a PhD part-time. So I actually got my PhD at the School of Education, but I cheated, and I studied business in a School of Education. And that's when I discovered corporate universities, which is the overlap between the world of business and the world of education. And when I completed my doctoral dissertation on corporate universities, I started working with corporate universities, going to conferences, talking to corporate university people. And we discovered that it was a growing field, and the idea of developing your people is generally a good idea. But at the time, there had only been one book on corporate universities. So I kept saying, we need another book on corporate universities. We need another book. And people would say, yeah, Mark, you should write it. And the problem was I would say, I'm not smart enough to write a book. Except I wouldn't say that out loud. And then I came up with the idea of doing a handbook where all these smart people that I worked with would contribute chapters. So we did the corporate university handbook. I did the first chapter and the last. But 12 other people wrote chapters for the book. And then the book came out, and it's got my name on the cover, and I collect the royalties. So it turns out I am smart enough to write a book. Worked in corporate universities for a number of years, and then I hooked up with an organization called the Human Capital Institute. How many of you are familiar with the Human Capital Institute? It's a great organization. I started teaching classes for them, and the classes were on the broader notion of talent management. And talent management is really about integrating the various functions. So obviously developing people is important, but there are a lot of other things like bringing talent into the organization, engaging it, and they really all go together. And as I talked to people in different organizations and heard about what they were doing, I collected stories which ended up becoming this new book, which actually just came out 2 weeks ago, called Aha Moments in Talent Management. And we'll talk about what some of those aha moments are. So that's who I am. What is talent management? The textbook definition is it's an integrated set of processes, programs, and cultural norms of an organization designed to implement, attract, develop, employ, and retain talent to achieve strategic objectives and meet future business needs. That sounds good. It's a very textbook definition, but it really covers it. From that, using the standard exchange rate of a picture being worth 1,000 words, I like this definition, and this comes right from the Human Capital Institute. And the idea here is every organization starts with a strategy, whether you're a for-profit, a non-profit, government. We still always have a strategy. right? It's a set of goals and a plan for achieving those goals. How many of you work for an organization that has a strategy? Anybody? Okay, about half, so pretty good. I wasn't asking, do you know the strategy? I'm just asking, somewhere in the organization. I mean, why would we share it with our HR people? But we've got a plan somewhere. And then typically within that strategy, there is a financial plan, right? A plan for how we're going to finance the strategy. And an IT plan. And ideally, there's a people plan. How many of you have some sort of people plan in with your organization's strategic plan? Not as many hands as we might hope for, but the reason it's so important, if I were to ask your CEO, what is the most valuable asset in your organization? What would he or she say? It's our people. And I actually ask that question whenever I meet a CEO, and it's really funny. You don't even have to finish the question. What's your most valuable? It's our people. It's like they teach them that on the first day of CEO school. If anybody asks, say it's our people. But then I ask a couple of more probing questions. One is, so how much of your time do you spend on the most valuable asset? Yeah, they don't usually laugh. I know why you're laughing. What do you suppose they usually say? They usually do something like this and go, yeah, not really enough, it should be more. What asset do the CEOs typically spend their time on? The financial assets, the money stuff. Forgetting that, of course, it's the people who generate that revenue. The other interesting question, and I want you to think about this one, every organization, every CEO says our people are our most valuable asset. Does your organization behave as if that were true every day? Does it really treat people as if this is our most valuable asset? And in many cases, the CEO reluctantly admits it. They genuinely believe it when they say it, but that's not always how we go about our daily business. So according to this diagram, you have a human capital strategy to support your business strategy. And the human capital strategy consists of the talent management practices that are around the center of the wheel. So what talent management is the effective practice of workforce planning, talent acquisition, engagement and retention, development and deployment. We want to do these things, we want to do them well, and we want to do them strategically in support of our organization's strategy. And the idea here is, if we do these things well, we will get good talent results. And since people are your most valuable asset, if we get good talent results, we will get good business results. So this is the formula for executing a strategy. Have a plan, have a people plan, execute the people plan, which is the talent management practices around the center of the wheel, and that's the ticket to good results. Make sense? So this led to my definition of talent management, a series of processes, those that we saw around the center of the wheel, that managers use to maximize the value of an organization's most valuable asset, talented people. So let's think about that, and so from now on, when I say talent management, this is what I'm talking about. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on the word talent, because in a lot of organizations, we use the word talent as if it were synonymous with the word people. And think about the word talent. Does it mean human beings? No, we have other words for that, like human beings and people. And I would imagine in your organization, you have different kinds of people. Do you have some extraordinarily talented people? And do you have some somewhat talented people? And do you have some other people who might be very good at concealing their talents? So to use the word talent synonymously with people is the kind of waste of an important word. And it turns out some research shows that top performers add 2 to 4 times the value, 2 to 4 times the value of average performers. Not 20 or 40% more, double, triple, 4 times the value. And we're not talking about the spread from your worst performers to your best. We're talking about your good people who perform every day and we're happy with their performance, but our stars deliver 2, 3, or 4 times the value. First question, do you know who these people are in your organization? The people who really add that double, triple, quadruple value? How many say yes, we know who they are? Okay. Next question. Do you reward them appropriately? Do we pay them 2, 3, or 4 times as much as the regular people? Do we pay them anything more? Some say no, and if we do, how much more do we pay them? 10, 15, 20%. So here's the question. If these people truly add double, triple, 4 times the value, what would you do to retain somebody like that? There's a one-word answer I'm looking for. Anything. You would do anything to keep those people. That's the real value in your organization. So when we talk about talent management, we're not just talking about good policies and procedures for our people. We're really talking about how to manage the most talented people so that they do what? Number one answer is stay. And then while they stay, what do we need to do? We need to keep them engaged, keep them productive, keep them happy. How do you keep these people happy? Depends on the person, which means how do you find out? You actually have to talk to them. Conversations. And it turns out there is a job in our organization who's charged with just that task. We call them managers. We don't call them HR professionals because you don't necessarily touch and talk to everybody every day. Managers do. So we're going to talk a lot about the role of the manager. We need to keep these people employed, therefore we need to keep them engaged. We need to reward them appropriately, but typically when people like this leave, it's not because of money. As a matter of fact, research shows money is very important at attracting people into an organization. It is not one of the main reasons why people leave. What's the number one reason why people leave organizations? Survey says, number one answer, managers. So we need to make sure that our managers are effective in their job. Their job is to engage and retain talented employees. So we'll talk a little bit more about the skills managers need and what we can do to make sure our managers are not driving talent out of the organization. Do you have some managers in your organization that are really good at retaining top talent? And you have some managers in your organization that are really good at driving top talent out the door? And if we're looking at these people who deliver 2 to 3 times the value of regular human beings, what do you suppose it costs us when we lose one of them? Thousands of dollars. We can maybe add a 0 or 2 to this. This is a very expensive proposition to lose them, try to replace them. If we do replace them, it's probably not with someone of equivalent value. What are the other reasons why people like this leave? And more importantly, what can we do to ensure that they stay? Give them a good manager, especially for top performers, interesting and challenging work. It's more about the work than the money. So now it comes down to what kind of work do they find to be interesting and challenging? Well, now it comes back to, I don't know, we got to ask them, we've got to talk to them. But they will stay for interesting work, even if they feel slightly underpaid. The thing about money is it serves 2 purposes. What's the main purpose of money? Buy stuff. The other purpose of money in our organizations is it's how we keep score. So to some extent, for these people, the money isn't just about compensation, it's about recognition. So the other thing we need to do is recognize them. And in some cases that recognition is money, but in other cases it's status, it's simply recognition, but it's especially about the work for these people. So let's keep in mind, when we say talent, we're talking about managing our most talented people. And I know there are some employment lawyers in the room. We manage these people differently. And I'm not suggesting that we treat anybody else unfairly, but we do need to reward the top performers more than we reward the ordinary or subpar performers. And those rewards could be monetary, but they could also be things like giving them the exciting, cool, interesting projects to work on. So, how does talent management fit within the world of HR? Well, it fits, and it's part of the conversation, but one of the questions people ask me, so talent management, is that just the new fancy name for HR? Because remember, we used to be personnel, and we didn't like that, so we changed the name to HR, but now we've had that for like 30 years. Is it time for a new name? Is talent management just a new name for HR? No, it is not. Talent management is a separate series of functions around this talent wheel. HR still has the other things to do, the day-to-day stuff that's very important, but HR also has a contribution in this talent management. And so if we think about these talent management functions, workforce planning, talent acquisition, engagement and retention of employees, employee development, is HR involved in these things? Absolutely. Does HR always have full responsibility for these things? No. So if you think about primarily engagement and retention, that falls on the manager. So where does HR fit? Well, HR needs to be able to help. And in fact, in all these talent management functions, HR should be the helping function. So the thing about workforce planning is a detailed and complex process that needs to be owned by the business. The business knows the workforce needs, and workforce planning is not the same as headcount planning. It's not the same as figuring out how many bodies we're going to need next year so that we can solve the equation of how much money do we need to spend on payroll next year. Workforce planning is about figuring out what's the right mix of skills to execute our strategy over whatever time period our strategy is, which is typically in the ballpark of 5 years. That skills planning, and in many cases we're talking about skills for jobs that don't exist today, that needs to be owned by the business. They know their business, they know where we're headed, much better than the HR professionals do. But HR professionals can understand the workforce planning process and can assist with that. When it comes to talent acquisition, HR helps, but typically final decisions are made by the business. Same thing with workforce development. We can help, but we don't know the specific needs of individual workers the way the business does. And finally, when it comes to engagement and retention, if engagement is low in your organization, it's not because HR hasn't been doing its job, it's because the managers have. If engagement is high in your organization, if you're in HR, you should take credit for it. But realistically, 15 out of the top 20 drivers of engagement, if you look at what drives engagement in an employee, the top 20 list, 15 out of the top 20 go directly to the immediate manager. So where does HR fit in with this? HR supports managers in making sure they have the skills and knowledge to perform these talent management functions. And this is a slightly different look for the HR profession. And one of the things that's happened is the HR profession has also transitioned into this new idea of the HR business partner. How many of you work for an organization that sometime in the last 2 or 3 years has transitioned to this role called HR business partner? How many? And we see this a lot. And in some cases what we've done is we have changed the title of our HR generalists to HR business partners. And then we've sent them out into the business, but we haven't given them the appropriate training, knowledge, and skills to execute on this role. Josh Gerson says the HR business partner should be like the VP of HR for the business. So just as the overall organization has a VP of HR, each business unit has an HR business partner, which should be like the VP of HR for that business. Which means the HR VPs need to be more than experts in HR. They need to understand the business and the world of business. They need to understand the industry and the context. A good friend of mine was a VP of HR for many years for a telecommunications firm. And then that company got bought out, and the parent company already had a VP of HR, didn't need 2 of them, so they let him go. So he took a job as the head of HR for a company doing downstream logistics. Anybody know what that is? Yeah, I don't either. More importantly, neither did he. He was one of the best HR guys I had ever known, and he knew the business of HR better than anybody. But he didn't know the business that the company was in. And he didn't last more than a year in that role. So it's no longer the case where we can be professionals in HR and just be an HR professional at any company. You really have to gain a deep understanding of the business you're in order to be this strategic business partner, this VP of HR to help your business. We also need to know how to think strategically. So a lot of what we've done in HR by necessity has been tactical, day-to-day, and operational. But it's so funny because I've been working with HR people for 15 years, and 10, 15 years ago, there was always the same mantra from HR people. We need a seat at the table. Have you heard this? We need a seat at the table. Oh yes. Well, guess what? HR now has a seat at the table. But now we need to speak the language that they speak at that table. And they don't speak our language. They don't speak the language of HR. They speak the language of business. They speak money talk, financial talk, and they talk strategically. So this strategic thinking skill becomes imperative. And ultimately, the HR VPs need to possess expertise in the talent management functions. You're not necessarily executing on each of those functions every day, but what you are doing is you're assisting the business and assisting the managers in workforce planning, talent acquisition, development and deployment, engagement and retention. So we need some expertise in talent management. Make sense? I'm going to leave time at the end for questions and comments and disagreements, but at any point, anybody have any questions on anything I've spoken about so far?
How many companies are really going to this talent management function that doesn't do the job?
It's an interesting question because, in fact, we haven't quite figured out the relationships yet. Talent management has become a nice buzzword, but we haven't quite figured out what it truly means. And in some cases, we use talent synonymously with people, which means talent management is the HR function, which it really isn't. So the question is, now that when organizations decide to get serious about talent management, do they just dump the whole project on HR and say, handle it? Or do they really strategically align HR with the line managers who have to execute? Now to answer your question, how many companies have really done it well? Very few that I've seen. It's really a work in progress. We're just trying to figure out this new HR business partner role and how the HR VP works with the managers. So we're working towards it, and I think we'll get there. And I think that question fits in with this next piece. So if that's the role of HR, then what's the role of the manager? Well, according to the Human Capital Institute and the organizations that get it, the job of the manager is to hire, develop, engage, and retain talented people. If you're a manager, hire good people, develop them, engage them, and retain them. Does that sound about right? It's the job of the manager? How many of you work for an organization that tells managers, this is part of your job? Your job is to hire, develop. How many of you tell your managers that? Really? Just 2, 3? That's part of the job, isn't it? So let me ask you a question. If you were put in charge of the world, and I know you've thought about the day will come when you're in charge of the world, to what extent would you hold managers accountable for hire, develop, engage, and retain? In other words, at the end of the year, when you sit down with your managers and say, okay, here's your list of goals, what % of their responsibilities and accountabilities should be hire, develop, engage, and retain? What do you think? Again, you're in charge. You run the world. 90%. I hear 90%. Anybody else?
75.
75.
I think lower, 50, 60%.
50 to 60. Do I hear 70? 78?
Results to produce too. It's the
They have to
management of the
produce
work.
results, right.
And you need this to produce the work well, but at the same time, they should be measured also on the work that's developed out of the teams.
So there is,
Both.
needs to be done and perhaps measured and accountabilities for. So I heard answers ranging from a minimum of 50 to 60, 75. For those of you who said 90, what about the results part? What about measuring results, sales, revenue, profit?
A manager, say they're doing 90%, all of the results come through their people. So if they're managing their people, the results are going to be there.
So if we do a good job of hire, develop, engage, and retain, we would get the good results. So here's what's interesting. When you're in charge of the world, it's a minimum of somewhere north of 50%, right? Which is our way of saying this is the most important part of the job. Perhaps as much as 90%. As a thought experiment, would it be horrible if we even said 100%? We hold them accountable for this, which means they're going to do this. We'll get the results, right?
But managers don't get rewarded based upon, usually on hire, develop, engage. They get, they get their, their bonus based upon how well their business unit does.
Okay, so we were having fun because I put you guys in charge of the world, and you brought us back to Earth. So, since we're going to do that, we all agreed if we were in charge, it would be somewhere between 50 and 100%. Now, back here on Earth, answer honestly, in the real-world organization where you work, to what extent are managers held accountable for hire, develop, engage, and retain?
Zero.
So now the answers, before, when you're in charge, the answers range from 50 to 100. When I asked for your real-world answers, they range from 0 to very little. I'm sensing a minor disconnect here. That was the first aha moment I decided to write about. You ask anybody with any common sense, should managers be held accountable for this? Everybody says, yeah, really, quite a bit. Then you ask people, so in the real world, what do we hold them accountable for? And the correct answer is everything else. What are the everything else's that we actually hold managers accountable for? Quality, sales, revenue, profit, growth. Now, I'm no expert, but are those things important in an organization? Revenue and profit and money? Of course they're important. And I think we all know the path to that is hire good people, develop them, engage them, and retain them. So why is it that we're holding managers accountable for the results side, not the things that are the important inputs to gaining those results? Measurement. You can't have accountability without measurement. Hire, develop, engage, and retain. Are those things hard to measure? Yes, they are. They're very hard. Are they impossible? No. No. How about sales, revenue, quality? Are those things easy to measure? Yeah. So we measure those because they're easy. How do we measure sales? We know how to count, right? We're good at counting. That's easy to measure. Quality of hire, quality of training. Those things are hard. You know what else is hard? What business are you in? How many of you are in the aerospace business? You guys make like rockets and bombs and things that fly? That's really hard. How many of you are in healthcare? Anybody make products that save lives? That's really hard. The things we do every day in our organizations are really hard, but we're not afraid to take on contracts to build things that fly. But suddenly we're talking about measuring quality of hire. Oh, that's too hard. Let's just count sales. These things are hard to measure, but they're not impossible. How many of you believe we could, if we were really focused on it, we could measure quality of hire? Yeah. But you know what? It's so much easier to measure what? How much it cost us to fill a position, how long it took to fill a position, right? We have bean counters and clocks, so we know how to measure cost and time. So let's just measure time to fill, cost to fill, and not worry about quality of hire. You can't hold managers accountable unless you can measure stuff. And we just don't have the will to measure this hard stuff, which means we don't hold managers accountable for these functions. And here's the thing about managers compared to regular human beings. They are smart. At some point, they demonstrated their smartness, and we promoted them to be a manager. And one of the things that their smartness allows them to do is they understand the reward system. And they do what we reward them for. So, to some extent, I'm not blaming the managers here for not focusing on hire, develop, engage, and retain. They are operating very rationally within the irrational worlds we've set up for them. We tell them what the measurements are, we tell them what the goals are, and they go there and they do that. They don't focus on this. We pay lip service. It's really important that you hire, develop, engage, and retain. And at the end of the year, we're going to measure you on sales and quality. Okay, they're smart. They heard the message. So let's talk about the importance of managers. Does your organization depict the managers higher up on the org chart than the regular people?
Yes.
Does it pay your managers more than it pays the regular people? So we're saying this job is important. How many of you have this concept of working managers? People who have responsibility for managing people, but also have other responsibilities. So being a manager is really important. You're higher up on the org chart. We give you more status. We give you more money. But it's a part-time job. Do it in your spare time. And I was teaching a class for the Human Capital Institute a couple of weeks ago. And this came up, and somebody in the class said that as a manager, they're so busy all the time. Does that sound about right? And they have so many responsibilities that the people management stuff tends to be stuff they just do in their spare time. Does that sound about right? Do you know managers that have a lot of spare time? So somebody in this class said one of her responsibilities as a manager is to do annual performance reviews for her employees. She never quite can get to them, and she said, so I end up doing them over the Christmas holidays. Which was shocking to me, because part of the reason we give people a week off at Christmas is so that they can rest and relax. The other part that was shocking to me is your annual performance evaluations are really important, aren't they? Do we want people doing that, like, with a stomach full of turkey and a tray around, and relatives in the house, and part-time in their spare time on New Year's Eve because they have some sort of deadline? And as soon as she said that, somebody else in the room said, I do mine over the Christmas holidays also. Suzanne?
This happens all the time, and I've recommended often that during the performance review period that the organization agree to every Thursday afternoon or dedicated days where they just agree everyone's just going to focus on doing their performance reviews. Like just for this 3-hour block or 4-hour block, everyone agrees that's what we're doing. No other meetings are taking place, no other phone calls. Somehow that never took off, but just think about it. If a manager just had a 3-hour solid block of time,
Right.
how much
So
he or she could accomplish.
What's staggering to me is
4-hour block.
we have to suggest that if only we could lay out 4 hours a week, half a day a week, for the managers where they could just do their job. Right? And outside of the logic of this, and we can't even manage to pull that one off. And the reason is, being a manager is really important. Hire, engage, develop, and retain is really important. But we're going to give you so many other responsibilities that this now becomes a part-time job. And I have become allergic to this notion of working managers. I think we need to realize this job is too important to leave it to people to do in their spare time while they have many other responsibilities. Other responsibilities which we are going to hold them accountable for to a much greater extent than their people management responsibilities. So you look at some exemplar companies, and I hate to say it, but GE is really good at this. If you're a manager at GE, you're a manager. This is your job. You do people management, you do performance reviews thoroughly and extensively twice a year, not just over Christmas, in great detail, and that's your job. You don't have to put aside special time for doing this. This is your job. So I think we need to recognize that talent management is not something that HR does for the business. Talent management is something that HR helps the business do, but ultimately it's the responsibility of the managers. So how do we get managers to focus on talent management? Number one, we hold them accountable for it. Now, in order to hold them accountable, we need to figure out how to measure our ability to hire, develop, engage, and retain. So think about hire. We talk about talent acquisition. Traditionally, we measure time to fill and cost to fill, right? How many of you have those metrics as part of your world? Why do we measure these? They're easy. But the first, and what?
Dollars.
And it's dollars. And the first rule of management is you get the results you measure. So let's say you put me in charge of filling this empty chair. And I know I'm going to be measured on time to fill and cost. What have you just motivated me to do in terms of time? Fill it quickly. So I'm going to round up the homeless. I'm going to get a body in that seat by close of business today. And by the metrics you've imposed on me, I'm going to look good.
Yep.
And what about money? Cost. What have you just motivated me to do? Fill it on the cheap. Right? So you have just motivated and encouraged me to fill this chair quickly and cheaply. Thank you. Can people do that? Yeah, you point them in a direction, they're going to go in that direction. What do we really want me to do in filling this seat? Quality.
Yeah, the best quality.
The best quality. We now talk about the 6 R's. The right person with the right skills and the right job at the right time in the right place for the right cost. Everybody get that? Good, because I don't think I can do it again. Time and cost are part of the equation, but we start with the right person with the right skills and the right job. How do we measure that? Yeah, you hear that silence? When I asked how do you measure time and cost, you were all over it, right? How do we measure the right person with the right skills? Well, before we can answer that, let me ask another question. When do we measure time to fill? When do we have the answer to that question? When it's filled, either when the guy accepts our offer or the day starts. But before this person shows up for work on day one, we've got the clock stopped. We know time. How about cost? When do we measure that? Same thing. Accepts the offer, we know how much it costs to fill the position. Now think about quality of hire. When would we measure that? The day he starts? We look at what a quality person he is?
After you assess
We have to measure it over time after we assess his work, his performance. When can we start really measuring and assessing his performance?
Day one.
We can start day one. When can we really feel like we can answer the question, this person is doing well on the job?
I think after 90 days.
You think 90 days?
You
It
should
depends
have
on,
it depends on the person, but you will have a realistic idea.
it doesn't depend on the person, it depends on the job.
Yeah.
There are some jobs that are simple, straightforward tasks, and after 90 days, the person's doing it or not. Think of the more complex knowledge type of work. I'll throw out one hypothetical example. An HR person. Think about the last time you started a new job. How long did it take before you really felt like you understood the job, the expectations, the culture, the environment, the players, and had a handle on the job? So I hear answers ranging from a year to not yet. But for a complex knowledge-based job, do you think we can really definitively say this person is performing well after 90 days? No. One humorous note, when do we typically have our probationary period? 90 days. And what do we know in 90 days? Do we know some stuff? Yeah, we know if he shows up on time, dresses appropriately, plays nice with other children. Are those important?
Yes.
Yeah. Do we know job performance after 90 days? Not really. So I don't think you can really start asking the performance question until about 6 months on the job. And I don't think you can really fully answer it until about 12 or 18 months. Here's the problem. You ask me to hire somebody for this seat. Are we willing to wait a year to answer the question, did I do a good job? Most organizations, we don't have the appetite to wait a year or a year and a half to determine if our recruiters or our hiring managers have done a good job of hiring. And yet we're still more than happy to evaluate them, even though we have little or no information. We're still willing to say whether they've done a good job. So we need to figure out how to measure the hard stuff. How about learning and development? I've spent a lot of time in that world. How do we typically measure a training program?
Smile sheets.
Smile sheets.
Survey, right? As
Little
they
survey.
finish this.
The moment they finish. You might even have some in front of you right now. And what we've learned after years of doing this is we bring in subject matter experts. We spend a lot of time in a room trying to push knowledge into people. And then we ask them important questions like, was the chairs comfortable? How'd you like the lunch? The temperature of the room okay? We get a lot of good information around those questions. What do we really want to know?
Did you learn it?
If they learned anything,
They can use.
and more importantly,
They can use.
not that they can use, but that they do use. And one of the most sobering statistics I've ever heard is 60 to 90% of everything people actually learn in training programs never gets used on the job. 60 to 90% never gets used. Do you believe that statistic? And do you believe it because of my inherent credibility? Or do you believe it because personal experience? Not only maybe some of us have conducted these programs, but more importantly, we've all sat in rooms, people have given us stuff. Have you ever done a training program that was a complete waste of time? Yes. Have you ever been to a training program where at the end you said, hey, that was kind of interesting and I learned something? And then you go back to work and do everything exactly the same way you always have? Turns out that one was a complete waste of time also. It didn't feel that way. And certainly when we filled out the thing and said, boy, I really learned a lot, my lunch was good, and they had cookies, it was interesting. It felt like a good program, but if you don't use it, there isn't a lot of value. 60 to 90% never gets used. If we take the midpoint of that, let's say 75%, we spend $120 billion a year, just in this country, $120 billion every year on training and development.